So let's just start with the book, right? Because the book starts with a story about 17,000 people getting arrested within 10 days, which, first of all, wow. But then when you find out that an AI algorithm is what selected them for arrest, you just start to think about movies like Terminator and Minority Report and all these dystopian B movies that we would find on cable TV at 2 o'clock in the morning. And it's like, this is actually happening in China.
Real time.
Yeah.
Real time.
And tell me what some of the reasons were for the AI picking people to get arrested, because I think this is even more disturbing because it's not even like a real crime, right?
So this is how it started. Chinese government tested the surveillance techniques in inland Chinese cities under the guise of doing this social credit system, establishing social credit system. And it worked to their benefit. It worked effectively. The Chinese citizens submitted a lot of personal information. And the person who was in charge of this project, the acts of genocide correctly been labeled by the United States government, was a party secretary in Tibet. His name is Chen Quanguo. He was appointed by Xi Jinping in August 2016 to enforce Xi Jinping's genocidal policies against the Uyghur people. So when Chen was appointed from Tibet to Xinjiang, that's the official name that Uyghurs call East Turkestan, he brought in his command center established in a old government hotel. You can imagine just like the movie scenes, multiple video cameras and screens. He lived and worked from that command center. This is a Communist Party secretary. His job is not a technology chief or surveillance chief. So he put in place something called Integrated Joint Operating Platform, IJOP. In Chinese, it's called Yitihua Xitong, which Human Rights Watch reverse engineered. So we knew about this platform, and we do know that then and now that China is the new Saudi Arabia when it comes to personal data. At the same time, we did not know the intrusive and random nature of this technological tool. So in early 2017, they start using the data that IJOP collected to order the police to rounded up everyone who should be rounded up. This is the slogan. This is the decree order given by the same guy, Chen, who was sanctioned under the Global Magnitsky Act. Once that order was released in about June, July of 2017, in one county that I cited in the book, a police department were ordered to round up 20,000 people. But the police could not locate those 20,000 people because the algorithm, the personal data can be sometime off because some people may have died, some people may have moved out of that jurisdiction, some people even may have taken up a foreign residency in another country. So the police was scratching their head, cussing at each other, and then the upper echelon said, "Now go find them." And then they go back and squeeze another 1,000 people. So in that 10 days alone, 17,000 people's lives are shattered. This was documented. This was actually part of the leaked document that the ICIJ International Consortium in Investigative Journalism, ICIJ, released with the help of Bethany Allen Ibrahimian a couple of years ago.
So they arrest 17,000 people, which just think about how many that is over the course of not even a couple of weeks. And the AI algorithm had selected them for arrest. And some of the reasons were they had a beard, they had a copy of the Quran, they were some of the stuff was mysterious. Nuri, I didn't understand. It was using the back door of their house too often. What does that mean? Is that literally what that means?
Yeah, the April 2017, when Xi Jinping came to the United States to spend time with former President Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago, the local government in Urumqi was enacting something called de-extremification measures, which is probably just like it sounds like a science fiction dystopia. some of the most draconian tools that the Chinese government put in place to go after the Uyghur population. So the 48 behaviors, as profiled in some of the publications as foreign policy, essentially makes you a candidate for concentration camp. That includes growing beard, even if it's for style. In today's Chinese society, vast majority of the Orthodox Jews who live in Brooklyn could have end up in a concentration camp because they grow beard. Amish community would have end up in a Chinese concentration camps. Maybe vast majority of the European soccer players who grow a beard might end up being in a concentration camp. I'm being cynical, but that's how little as you have to display to be a candidate for the concentration camp. Objecting your children's marriage to non-Uyghur, non-Muslim individuals. Interference in the children's marriage, love affair, can be perceived as a sign of extremism. Adhering to halal diet, like the Jewish people who adhere to a kosher diet, the Uyghurs follow halal diet preference. And abstention from cigarette, sex, alcohol. And also, ironically, using too much of electricity. That shows that you spend too much time surfing online, charging your phone too many times, and then leaving the back door instead of front door. It's creepy. If you leave the front door, they can surveil you. But if you leave the back door, they may not be able to keep track of your in and out activities from your own home, domicile. So it's so draconian. And you mentioned the Minority Report. For the Chinese to detain individuals based on those 48 behaviors is essentially preemptive policing, as they proudly declare. You don't have to actually commit any crime, but for the fact that the government believes or perceives that you may commit a crime or commit acts of violence in the future, then you should be sent to the concentration camp.
So essentially, AI tells police which people are likely to commit a crime, except these are religious and cultural and almost like thought crime type stuff, political crime, and then they get arrested without it and then put in a prison without a trial before they can actually commit the crime. So yeah, it really is Minority Report, but in real life, terrifyingly dystopian. And this all sounds awful, but we said 17,000 people, but now how many people are in these re-education camps approximately? I assume we don't have real concrete numbers, but I assume we have estimates somewhere.
Before I get to that important question, I need to highlight something. Before the April 1, starting 2016, they rounded up Uyghur thought leaders. When you mentioned the word thought leader, it just remind me of that, something very important. The custodian of Uyghur cultural heritage, the authors, stage performers, athletes. Even in one instance, a guy who went to Spain to get training with Lionel Messi ended up being in a concentration camp because he had a travel history. So they attacked the social elites, the thought leaders, academics, religious leaders, business leaders, before they starting this IJOP-supported rounding up. As for the numbers, the Pentagon official Randy Shriver, who served in the Trump administration as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Affairs, told the public through media and his speech on the Hill in summer 2019 that his agency believed that anywhere between 2 to 3 million Uyghurs been locked up in the concentration camp. And then based on Chinese government's white paper published 2 years ago, it specifically bragged, I wrote about this in my essay published in Foreign Affairs last year. So essentially it says from the time period of 2015 through 2019, 1.3 million Uyghurs annually been sent to re-education camps. So the re-education camps is a euphemistic term for the concentration camps. So if you add them up, you can come up with a staggering number. What we're talking about is about 12 million population, 11 to 12 million, based on the official statistics. The Uyghurs disagree with that. That's a separate matter for another conversation. But even if it's a 3 million, that's the 4 times the size of the population of our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has about 750,000 people. And then give you a perspective. During the height of the Nazi Germany, the highest number of Jews being were arrested at maximum is about 750,000. So the Chinese practice, as eloquently described by former Secretary of State Pompeo, is stain of the century. So the world has not seen anything like it since the Holocaust era.
Tell us about this, the QR code system on the phone. Can you describe this a little? This is also quite dystopian and Orwellian.
Yeah, so there's a QR code system that Chinese people are forced to use, where you basically need a QR code on your phone to get into anywhere, right? You're not allowed to get on a bus. You're not allowed to get on a train. You're not allowed to get into your work building. You're not allowed to go into a grocery store or a wet market or anything. Every single facet of life needs this QR code, and you're only allowed to get into these places if that QR code is green, right? If it's yellow, if it changes to yellow, that means someone in the area has, there's a case, or there's at least a warning of a case, right? Then if it's red, it means that you yourself have been directly in contact with COVID. So that means you're sent off to the quarantine camps, right? At least that's what it was until fairly recently. So this QR code system has dictated everyone's life for the past, I don't know, a couple of years that it's been implemented. And it's really proven that this whole thing for the Chinese government was less about COVID and more about a control mechanism for the people, because what has been demonstrated time and time again is that there have been protests leading up to what we've seen recently, the big ones. And what happens is, let's say a bank refuses to give people their investments, right? All of a sudden, people crowd around the bank and they hold up placards and they're like, hey, bank, give me some money. What the government will do is they can manually, because let's be honest, it's controlled by the central government, they can just turn everyone's codes to red, right? So then that protest gets dispersed, everyone gets arrested, everyone goes to quarantine camps, or everyone, sometimes just gets scared and leaves, right? So it's a real control mechanism that has stopped people from going to places the government doesn't want them to, and also tracks everyone where they go. I mean, this is all tied to your locations as well. It's where you go, where you usually are, where you're going to be. And this is now handed over to the central government. This is all information to track every single citizen in the entire country. It's really just a dream come true.
Contact tracing on its face. Hey, it seems like a good idea. You know, if somebody near you got infected, you can quarantine voluntarily. But that's not really what's happening with this QR code system. What's happening is the government is, of course, using it to track where people are going. But tell me about this bank protest, because this was just the most obvious glaring abuse of the QR code system for completely not legit reasons.
I mean, this actually happened a ton of times throughout the country, but the bank protest is a good catalyst. So in Henan, some people were protesting because the banks were basically scamming them out of their money, for lack of better words. And so naturally in China, there are a lot of protests in China, as long as they're not against the government. There's protests against, like, let's say your building management is failing, or let's say what's it called? There's a thing that's happening with Japan, so you're allowed to protest against Japan, and the government even stokes some of those things, and it gives this impression that, hey, yeah, protests are allowed in China, but there's never really protests against any sort of government body, right? We can go back to the same thread. China doesn't want people protesting against the government. So this Henan bank protest thing happened. People started protesting the bank, but also protesting the local government for not doing anything about the banks, right? For not getting their money, forcing the banks to give them their money. So when the people protested, the government used the QR code to change everyone to red to disperse the protests, right? So this is another control mechanism. They've done this multiple times. When everyone's QR code goes to red, a lot of people are going to disperse, and then they actually have legal, kind of on the face legal ways to move people to quarantine camps and stop those protests.
Crazy, right? So basically they'll just say, oh, look, everyone around you is infected. You better go in. And it's, again, completely just for control. Like, we don't really want you protesting this. So what we're going to say is that you've been infected, or that you are going to be infected. Now you can't go in you can't go in transit, you can't go in restaurants, you literally just have to go home. And if I would assume if the police catch you outside and you have a red QR code, you get arrested.
Yes, yes. It's not necessarily criminal. It's more like you go to, you go to your quarantine camp, you go into that, those capsules, those basically, 18-wheeler capsules that they've repurposed for locking people up. And a huge chunk of the economy is actually running off of COVID testing and these kind of quarantine facilities now.
I wondered about that.
Yeah. Which is crazy because they're trying to implement a lot of changes in China to reduce some of the restrictions for the COVID policies, but they've built a huge chunk of their economy around this. And they've also, I think you brought up a really good point when you said there was this unspoken rule that if you let people make money or you let people have their business, they're going to have no reason to protest because, we can be an authoritarian country and you're not allowed to say or do what you want, but you got money, which means it's better than Mao's time. It's better than the Great Leap Forward / Cultural Revolution. It's not that bad. And if people have that recent memory in their mind about how life was so poor and terrible, then making money just makes everything better. And that's how China's kind of allowed to their citizens to keep going. It's like, okay, as long as every year you get a little bit richer than you were last year, then everything's going to be fine. Nobody's going to actually have a problem. And that's by and large been the case. Not to say that people didn't have massive transgressions with the government, but by and large, as a general huge populace, people have been okay to do that. And for the first time, we're seeing under the current regime, and that's just not the case. The economy is basically, just imagine a plane just nosediving into the ground right now. Because what the Xi Jinping regime has done is completely forgotten why China's gotten to where it's been now. They've completely lost the plot. Western investment, foreign companies experimenting with capitalism, opening up its economy to the rest of the world is why China is where it is today. It's the fact that it was allowed to earn money and they allowed the people to earn money is why China is where it is today. It's why it has global influence. And now to say I think it's a delusion, but I think that a lot of the top leadership and Xi Jinping has surrounded himself with so many yes men that it's gotten into a lot of people's heads that the only reason China's wealthy is actually because of the Chinese government.
Right.
It's actually because of government policy. Yes.
There's always the dictator trap. They're surrounded. They get rid of people who tell them things they don't want to hear, and people are afraid to tell them the truth from the ground up. So even if you have, let's say you have a couple good advisors around you who you say, look, really, I need to hear the truth from you. The people below them aren't going to tell them the truth, or the people below them aren't going to tell them the truth. So if you think, look, we have enough, let's say PPE, right? Masks and ventilators or something, or vaccines. Yeah, vaccines are good. The program's going great. Well, how do you know that? Because the people under you lied, and the people under him lied, and the people under him lied, and the local officials were afraid to tell the guys. So there's 17 levels of people kind of bullshitting. Or kind of fudging or being afraid. And you have to make sure that there's no fudging and that there's accurate checks and balances in all those people. And none of that is in place. So even if you're surrounded by great advisors, are those people surrounded by officials that can tell them the truth? And are those mid-level people also working above a bunch of other people that can tell them the truth? Because if there's a little bit of corruption at every level or even a lot, which there is, you really have no idea what your vaccination rate is or what your where the PPE is stored. And I think that's kind of what Russia's dealing with right now. You know, it's not necessarily that Putin is this crazy, irrational guy. It's that he probably thinks he does have working tanks. He probably thinks he does have a bunch of missiles left because nobody's going to go, ooh, yeah, you know what? We sold those. But we had a hell of a vacation in Monaco afterwards. But yeah, and if those people would have told them the truth, well, would the commanders and the generals and the officers below them tell them the truth? No, absolutely not. So you end up with the same thing in China. Nobody knows what's going on at the top because nobody wants to get, nobody's, the shooting of the messenger is a thing, especially
it is a real
in dictatorships.
Thing. China had a semblance of checks and balances, nowhere near like a liberal democracy, but a semblance of checks and balances because there were different power cliques within the party. There was different gangs within the party that would keep each other in check and kind of come together and say, well, next term, we're going to appoint someone that represents this and this and this principle, right? And because Xi Jinping got rid of all opposition, all those cliques, all those people that held different ideals. Maybe one guy was more like, I think we should have more communist principles that actually have social programs for people in the countryside. Then another guy says, we should definitely focus more on the coastal regions because that's the economic driver of the country. they can come together and be like, yeah, we hate each other and we're not in the same clique and we're actually diametrically opposed to each other and we're actually trying to like depose each other. But there's so many people involved that it creates this bizarre, almost pseudo-functional system within China
like
that
Congress.
has been eradicated.
They're shooting each other in the foot, but they have to play the game.
Yes.
So stuff actually ends up getting balanced at some level in a weird way.
At some level, in a weird way, right? And it's nowhere near our liberal democracy, but it kind of works. It keeps China going into chaos, and now we're looking at China where it's tanking its own economy, thinking that it's the government's the only reason that it got to where it is, and the people are not getting that unspoken rule. They're not getting the returns on anything. They're watching their money dry up, and they're watching more restriction come in return getting nothing for it. So again, huge catalyst for the protests.
Where are we now with autonomous AI, where it's like machines that shape the world around us as opposed to merely understanding it? So, self-driving cars, drone swarms that paint houses or install windows on skyscrapers. Where are we kind of in this? Is it a spectrum? Is it a timeline? Where are we with these?
We're actually making tremendous progress, and a lot of that progress is coming from China, because China is the factory of the world, and China has a strong incentive to automate the factories because the blue-collar workers in China are making twice as much money as those in Vietnam and other lower wealth countries. So as a result, the only way China can continue to produce goods for the world is to automate. So there's a strong push to automate. And starting at the factory is the right place, because that's where you can afford to pay $1 million for an equipment that can automatically do something that maybe hundreds of people do today. And once it's perfected for the manufacturing environment, it can move into commercial. So robots for shopping malls and restaurants. And once that works, it can move to our home, and robots can do our dishes and clean our homes and cook for us. So that is the progression from starting from manufacturing. And within manufacturing, we can break down various tasks that we might want robots to do, starting from visual inspection using computer vision. That's arguably the third wave, but still an important process in the factories. And then moving to moving. Moving things around turns out to be a lot easier within a factory or a warehouse. As people know, Amazon bought a company called Kiva, that when you buy a bunch of things and there's a box that's coming to your home, the Amazon Kiva robot will move the shelf to a person who will pick an item, put it into the box. Another shelf to the person, pick the item. That's the current workflow. So moving the shelves is the relatively easier thing. So anything having to do with forklifts or people walking around pushing things, that will be wiped out and gone and done with robotics. Then after that, the picking. Increasingly, picking has been improving. And picking is simpler or more difficult depending on what industry you're in. For example, if you're always picking the same thing, like in a laboratory environment, a technician, or doing a COVID test, that's very easy because you can just customize for that. Picking any arbitrary thing can be difficult because an egg will break, right? So that requires a lot more work. Then there is the hand-eye coordination, things that require dexterity with a very fine, putting a screw in place, etc. That's longer term. So in the factory, we're seeing right now, going from easy to hard, increasing number of repetitive routine work being done by robots. So that's a lot of progress being done. And some of that technology is now making its way into non-manufacturing environments. So for example, many Chinese restaurants today have waiters, waiter bots. They're not humanoid.
Bots. Right.
They are bots. You go to a restaurant.
Okay.
So when I go to some of the restaurants, I go in, I place an order on my phone, and then a tray walks up to me. Not a humanoid robot, but a tray rolls itself to me with the dishes I ordered. I take it off, and then it sees that I took it off. I finish eating, and then I click to pay. No human contact in the entire process. So that's already functioning in a number of restaurants in China. And also in consumer, in my apartment, when I buy something on the Chinese Amazon equivalent or the Chinese delivery equivalent for fast food, a robot actually brings it from the reception up to my room. So that was originally put in place to minimize contact and spreading of COVID, but now it's standard. It's so convenient because I can just go open the door in my pajamas. I don't have to worry about being embarrassed because it's just a robot that sees me, not a human. So that automation is going rather quickly. And of course, autonomous vehicles, we've had some ups and downs, but I think my belief is that you want to launch in relatively simpler environments like forklifts, followed by airport luggage transportation, followed by trucks, followed by buses with fixed routes, followed by robo-taxis. And that's kind of the rollout we see in China today. The simpler scenarios have been nailed. We're going to tougher scenarios. I think in the US, Waymo and Tesla tend to go directly to the tough problems, two different ways to solve the problem, both valid. And I think we're going to see relatively autonomous vehicles on the streets of US and China and other countries in the next 5 years. We're going to see a lot of them.
I mean, we see them already in Silicon Valley. It's just that there's somebody behind the wheel texting and pretending to drive so that they don't run anybody over, right? But you can't get in one and you can't call it on your phone. It's just being tested. But it's going to be kind of, I mean, are you personally ready to get into a self-driving car and just be like, all right, it's going to be very hard for those of us that grew up driving, I think.
Yeah, so as a technologist, I can recommend to your audience that it depends on the environment and constraint. You may or may not want to get into a fully autonomous vehicle just yet. So if it's a bus shuttling people at the airport, no problem. Very simple scenario. If it's in a tourist spot, probably no problem. If it's in a truck only on the highway, or actually cars in the highway, generally okay, safer than people. If it's in a bus, robo-bus with no humans, I would say it's okay because also it's fixed route, so it can get a lot of data on a small number of permutations. But if it's really a car that takes you anywhere, anytime, any weather, any time of the day, and with no safety driver in that car, I would say that's quite challenging and unsafe, at least for this year and maybe next year. I would wait and see the numbers of fatalities before I would completely delegate driving to autonomous vehicles.